law student. We are told to get involved with the legal profession as a student. I guess it is an area where we can get some practical work from.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you did when you were a student?
I didn't, but my situation was a little bit different. I was already in the Air Force when I finished my law degree, and the Air Force in fact paid for the final bit of my degree. And the deal was that I would then stay on and work for a certain number of years as a military lawyer, which I did. And so the job was already sort of waiting for me there when I got out. So I didn't have to go through that process. But I do think for most undergraduates, it's absolutely crucial to get involved with the local community, the local legal community. And you can do that by volunteering. You can do that by getting involved in law society groups. So you can, if you lean left, you can join Labor Lawyers. You can join the Women's Legal Association. You can join Lawyers for Human Rights. You can volunteer for Salvo's Legal Humanitarian. There's bunches of things you can do that start exposing you to other people in the profession, and sooner or later those people are going to be looking for a bright graduate, and hopefully you'll come to mind.
Okay, so that's a good tip to go out and get your own experience.
I think it's crucial. Yeah. If you're intending to practice, I think it's crucial.
Because you can achieve high distinctions throughout your studies, but it doesn't make you a legal practitioner.
Well, high distinctions do say something about you, because you don't get high distinctions unless you're smart. Mm-hmm. You don't get high distinctions unless you can write. You don't get high distinctions unless you can manage your time. Mm-hmm. So there are a bunch of positive things that getting high distinctions says about you. The question is whether those tick the boxes that people are trying to tick when they're recruiting. And that's not always the case. So what you've got to be thinking about is, if I was the employer, what would I be looking for? How do I become that person?
Okay. So what was your first job as a legal practitioner?
Like I said, I was in the Air Force. So my first job was as a military lawyer. I was a legal officer at Headquarters Ground Training Wing at RAF Base Wagga, and then a legal officer in Headquarters Combat Support Group at RAF Base Amberley here in Queensland.
Okay, and then you've also been counsel assisting the coroner?
Yes.
Following the Air Force?
Yes.
So what was your experience in this job? Because that would involve a lot of death and grief, I would believe.
It does, and there were some very emotionally difficult aspects of working in coronial work. There are some photographs that I can look at in my mind's eye right now, and some of the deceased people who I really felt like I came to know quite well through the process of learning about their life and ultimately learning about their death. But at the same time, coronial work in its own way is quite a joyful jurisdiction, where you have the opportunity to do good, you have the opportunity to produce changes, and you have the opportunity to bring people an understanding of the story that led to the loss of their loved one. I remember one particular occasion when a lady, her husband had died in an accident where he'd been riding a bicycle and had been hit by a truck. And it turned out that the lady in the car behind had gone and sat with him, and she had seen immediately that he would die. And she held his hand and said the Lord's Prayer and just sat there with him while he died. And it was so meaningful to his wife to learn that he hadn't been on his own, to learn that someone had been sitting there with him and holding his hand when that moment came. And, the whole inquest, the whole weeks of work were worth it just for that one moment, because we could tell the story of this gentleman's death in a way that was meaningful. I also love the fact that you get exactly the same inquest whether you are the Prime Minister or whether you are an unemployed drug addict. It doesn't matter where you are in society. If the nature of your death calls for an inquest, you get exactly the same inquest, and it's all funded by the state. I think it's one of the most challenging, but at the same time, one of the most rewarding jobs that a lawyer can do.
Okay, and while working this job also, you were able to make changes to the way we deal with domestic violence?
I was counsel assisting for the inquest into the death of a lady named Nolene Butel. And we did make a number of recommendations. Well, I made a number of recommendations to Coroner Hutton, and he made a number of findings, and some of those were picked up by Quentin Bryce in the Not Now, Not Ever report, and some of her recommendations were then translated into legislation by Premier Palaszczuk. But I have to say, I was one part of the process, and I don't want to overemphasise my role. Really, I think most of the credit needs to go to a domestic violence specialist by the name of Susan Beattie, who really pushed for this to become an inquest. And I was quite dubious about it at first, and she pushed and she was right. And it eventually became probably one of the most important trials that I'll do in my career.
In Nolene Butel's case, you were able to make changes to the way the law deals with domestic violence. What does this mean, and is it enough? I mean, what else could be done for domestic violence victims?
Well, some of the changes that came out of Ms Butel's inquest, one of the things that we were talking a lot about was changing the attitude of police and the education for police around domestic violence, but at the same time acknowledging the frustration of police in the sense that they spend an extraordinary amount of their time dealing with domestic violence incidents that really just shouldn't be there. So you can't just be too straightforward about saying, oh, police attitudes have got to change. Police attitudes needed to be dealt with, but at the same time, it was a complex policing situation. But one of the proposals was that there be increased awareness and specialisation for domestic violence focused police in the police service. A second one was around support to general practitioners, to give general practitioners more options to help women to engage with support services, because quite often a GP is actually the person who a woman is most likely to feel comfortable going to say, this is happening in my life and I might need some help. The third thing was around the idea of a one-stop shop, and I understand that there's one operating down on the Gold Coast somewhere now, where a woman who has left a violent relationship can go into one place and they can get Medicare sorted, and they can get Centrelink sorted, and they can get all of the different government services sorted without having to try and go across town all day. So they can go to one place, they can engage with all of the necessary help-seeking support services in the one spot, which means that there's less opportunities for things to go wrong, because often when something goes wrong along the way, that becomes a reason to see the whole thing as being too hard, and then the abuser just sort of magnetically draws the person back into the situation, and you know it can be desperately difficult to overcome that.
Okay.
Can I just say, all of these things are good. If we want to eliminate domestic violence in our society, the only way that we can do that is by finding ways for men to cease committing acts of domestic violence. Support services for women are great. Crisis services for women are great. But the problem doesn't get fixed until men stop committing acts of domestic violence. And so a lot of the work that seems to be starting now in this area is around trying to identify what causes men to behave violently towards intimate partners in particular, and what sorts of things can be done to try to intercept those behaviours before they become really problematic, and certainly before they become homicidal, which is obviously where they intersect with the coronial system. But ultimately, the answer here is around changing men's behaviours rather than about providing support for women. You need to do both, but until you change the men's behaviours, you're just going to have an escalating need for support services for women.
So, following on from that, you've also done some work in family law. How do you? What's your impression of the family law system in Australia?
I think the family law system has hundreds and hundreds of really good people trying to operate a really broken system. And it's broken because fundamentally the adversarial system of justice that works so well in most of our law completely doesn't work in family law, because you take two people who hate one another's guts and you say, we would now like you to dissipate every piece of wealth that you've ever earned by handing it all to lawyers in order to invest in how much you hate that person's guts. And we have a whole system that is really designed to let people do that. Now, of course, for many, many couples, they do find a sensible way to separate, and it never ends up anywhere near a court, and that's great. But there is still always going to be these high conflict cases. And those high conflict cases are arguably where people need the most support from the system. And the system kind of pitchforks them into a really adversarial process. And I'm constantly in awe of how wonderfully the judges do and how wonderfully people like the family reporters do. But they're trying to drive a system that is simply not right for the purpose of family law.
So wave your magic wand and create a new family law system. What would it look like?
If I was going to have it, I'd want all parenting matters resolved within 6 weeks of them commencing. I would want to have one hearing that lasts maybe 3 or 4 hours. On the bench, I would want a legal practitioner of some sort, so a judge or a registrar or a justice of the peace, and alongside them, a social worker or a child psychologist or someone with that sort of training. Mum and dad get an hour each to present their cases. They have to do the talking themselves. They can have a legal advisor there with them, but the lawyer doesn't do the talking. Mum and dad do the talking. At the end of that hour, anything that they can agree on goes into the parenting orders. Anything that they can't agree on, the bench decides. And they walk out of there at the end of the day with a set of orders on the day. I would also make it a rule that no legal practitioner or no firm can charge more than $5,000 plus GST for a family matter. Because I think if you put a cap on how much firms were allowed to charge, goodness, you'd see a lot more settlements, because there would be no reason to keep allowing a client to run on and on and on with a matter when there was an obvious settlement that you could advise them about. Because you do see some firms that just make extraordinary amounts of money from single family law cases. It's just amazing.
Yes, I can imagine. So that's something very different to what we see today, and hopefully maybe one day we can go down that track.
Well, look, maybe my answer's not the right answer as well, but I do think we need to have some really creative and different thinking about how family law works, because at the moment, all it's doing is creating victims.
And more problems.
Yeah, I think so.
So, Anth, nowadays you work in commercial law for Pacific Maritime Lawyers. Tell us about that work. Is it as stressful as coronial or family law?
Yes, but the stresses are different. When you're dealing with commercial law, you're usually dealing with people's livelihoods. You're dealing with a company that they might have spent many years building up. You're dealing with people love their companies, they love their possessions in much the same way that they love their families often. And they're entrusting you with that. They're entrusting you with their livelihood, with their capacity to provide for their families and their future. And that's just as important of a trust as anything else that you do in the law. And you do want to get it right. You don't want to let your client down. And if you're not stressing, then you're probably not taking things seriously enough.
So family law can be quite stressful.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any job in legal practice that is not stressful to some degree. If you're not prepared to do stressful work, then this really isn't the career for you. And it's stressful because things matter. It's stressful because there's real consequences for people when they are dealing with the law. But those people are still going to deal with the law anyway. It's just a matter of whether they deal with the law on the basis of having competent advice from professionals who are really trying to do a hard job, do a good job. I'm accepting that my work is going to be stressful because I want to be that lawyer who does a really good job. I think that pretty much any job is going to have its stresses. This is the job I've chosen and the stresses I've chosen to take on. And I wouldn't have it any other way.